Okay, Rick, the recording has started. We can go ahead and get started.
Great. Thank you. So hello, everybody. This is Rick Wilson with Martin Associates. Hope everybody is staying safe and healthy out there. So we thank you for taking out the time today to join us for our presentation, Managing Fixed Asset Year-End with also Sage 100 integration with fixed assets. So that's presented today by Wayne Austin with Sage Software. So thank you, Wayne. Before we get started, we got a couple of these housekeeping items. So please go ahead and mute your microphone. We don't really have a way to press the button for everybody. With that said, if you've got questions, please use the chat feature in the console, and then we'll address all those questions at the end. And then, as Wayne also mentioned, we're going to be recording this. So we will be sending out emails with follow-up information, including a link to the website out on our Martin & Associates website. So I think that's about it. Go ahead, Wayne, and take it away. It's all yours.
Thanks, Rick. All right, welcome, everyone. Today, we are going to be talking about managing your fixed assets through their complete life cycle, and we're going to be focused on really year-end activities. Today's agenda, we will give you an overview.
Hi, folks.
Okay,
Hey,
yeah, they're muted there.
Yeah.
Okay, so on today's agenda.
I'm good now. Okay.
All right, I just muted everyone, so that should take care of that. Okay, in today's agenda, we're going to be covering an overview of the Sage Fixed Asset Solution. I'll give you a good eye view of what the integration with Sage 100 looks like. And I'm also going to be sharing resources that are available to you to help with your year-end activities surrounding fixed assets. I'm also going to actually leave some time to go into the solution so you can see what the application looks like, ease of use, and how you can access all of the year-end reporting and things that you would need for year-end. So first, let's take a look at what is the value of using the Sage Fixed Asset Solution. So especially if you're doing tax, this will certainly help you with maintaining compliance with IRS tax laws as well as GAAP rules. It does integrate a two-way integration with Sage 100, and I will go a bit deeper into that as well. This is also going to really help with ensuring you're getting clean and accurate data in, which of course results in getting accurate reporting out of the solution. There's also ways to use this tool to actually help you eliminate overpayment of taxes and insurance. I'm actually going to go pretty deep into that as well, so you'll get a good idea of some of the steps you can actually take to minimize that type of exposure. There are also some good resources involved in the solution where you can actually use this by attaching images, invoices, things like that of your assets to help if you do have to go through a process of filing insurance claims due to some type of disaster. It's also going to significantly improve how you communicate with any outside accounting firms that you may be using because of the accuracy and concise reports you can actually get out of the solution. If you do need audit reporting as far as security access, who's made changes to what, and so on, there are Sarbanes-Oxley compliant reports also included in the solution. But first, let's take a quick look at just the fixed asset life cycle in general. Now, certainly, all of you may not need all steps involved here. So, for example, during the acquisition phase, if you don't have any type of construction in progress or CIP, when you purchase new assets, you're going to be placing them directly in service. If you do have some type of CIP activity where you're going to have additional roll-up costs before them being placed in service, the planning module will actually handle that, and I'll cover that in detail as well. During the depreciation cycle of your fixed assets, this is where you do all of your depreciation calculations for tax or for GAAP, state, AMT as needed. You'll certainly also need to be able to handle transactions such as transfers and disposals, be it full or partial. other step in the asset life cycle is you certainly need to be able to do complete physical inventories to ensure that you actually know what you have and where it is. And you need to be able to report on all of these activities. Now, certainly at the end of an asset's life cycle, or if it's somehow failed, needs to be replaced, you need to be able to do disposals and accurately report on your gain-loss calculations based on those disposals. So let's take a look at how the Sage Fixed Asset solution addresses each of these phases of the fixed asset life cycle. First, let's look at acquisition. So let's say you've done a transaction in Sage 100, and you've purchased, some assets, and you're doing either an AP transaction or PO transaction for those assets. If that asset is a part of some project, it's going to have additional roll-up cost. Before it's placed in service, that's where the planning module comes in. That'll handle all of your CIP phases, gives you the ability to report on actually two sets of numbers. You can report on your actual spend against both an original as well as a revised budget. Capture all those realized costs that roll up within that individual line item. And once spending is complete on that item or on the project, you can place those items directly in service in the depreciation module. Now let's take a look at the depreciation module, which is really the heart of the system. It does have all of the IRS tax laws included. We do update that each year, so you're always up to date. It also, of course, enforces GAAP rules, and we currently have 52 depreciation methods built into the solution. You also have the ability to create custom depreciation methods as well. It does have some really good tools included. There's actually an audit advisor, which you can run against the tax book since all of the tax rules are built into the solution. It's going to take a look at how you're treating your assets within a particular company, and it's going to identify any issue that's a potential red flag for you to get audited. It's going to identify an issue, it's going to recommend a resolution, and it's even going to create a group where any asset that is creating that exception would be easily identified in that group, where you can then take the corrective action and rerun the audit advisor to make sure everything is clean. It does include many standard reports in the solution, including an actual 4562. It also does include a sale of property report. Now, if you take a look at the tracking module, this is what you would use for doing physical inventories of your fixed assets. Now, you would be able to, for example, barcode those assets, go out and actually use an Android app or a traditional scanner, scan those barcodes and update anything that's changed on those items. The tracking module really allows you to ensure you're keeping track of what you have and where it is. Now, one of the big impacts of this, of course, this is really the tool that you would use for identifying ghost assets. So ghost assets would be assets that you have in your registry, but they're either discarded or unusable, could be caused by theft or fraud, or they're simply being taken out of service and not being communicated to the accounting staff. But this can, of course, have pretty significant financial impact. This can result in you having overpayment on taxes, overpayment on insurance premiums, and it certainly would impact productivity. Certainly, especially if they're business critical assets. Now, this could also impact your budgeting process since you may not have planned for replacing these assets that you assumed were in service when in fact they're not. So you're certainly not going to be budgeting for replacing these types of assets. The other side of this is also true with zombie assets, which would be assets that are out there in service. Someone has made the purchase, but they have not communicated this information to the accounting staff. Now, how can that have a negative impact? For example, if you look at IT assets, you order 20 additional computers, you don't have them on the books, you may not be in compliance from a licensing standpoint, for example, and you're certainly not going to have them included on your insurance since you actually don't have a record of them in your database. So both sides of the coin here are very important to you, ensuring that you know what you have, where they are, and that you can eliminate assets that you don't have on the books, and now you can include them, but also assets you do have on the books but are actually missing, you can do a proper disposal and actually get those assets off the books. Now, in addition to all of the standard reports included in the solution, you do have the option to get custom reporting. What that's going to do is give you the ability to further customize reports within the solution, but also gives you a fully integrated version of SAP Crystal Report. And that enables you to create any type of ad hoc reports that you may choose to build something from scratch, or you can export a standard report out to Crystal and further customize it. It does have access to every field in the database. So what that would give you the ability to do, if, for example, you have multiple companies in the database and you want to build some type of consolidated report looking at assets from multiple companies, you could do that using Crystal Reports. Let's talk a bit about the integration with Sage 100. It does have a two-way integration with Sage 100, so you can actually create assets from the accounts payable or the purchase order module and create those assets directly in the depreciation module of fixed assets. You can actually even launch the fixed assets module from inside of Sage 100. If you take a look at this screenshot from a visual workflow in Sage 100, you can actually set up this workflow, go directly into an AP or PO transaction, while in the accounts payable or purchase order transaction, you can identify all of the pertinent information such as cost, the invoice date, and so on. But if you look at the right graphic, at the bottom portion, you'll see asset template. You can actually create templates in the depreciation module. All of those templates are made available to Sage 100. And where that helps, if you're telling it to create an asset from an accounts payable transaction, as I'm doing here, and telling it to apply a template, in your template, you can populate information such as depreciation method, asset class, estimated life for all of the books. So in that manner, you're eliminating any type of duplicate entry. So you can ensure that any asset you're creating from an accounts payable transaction or from a purchase order transaction, by applying that template, it's going to be placed in service with everything it needs to start depreciation. So you would not have to separately go into the depreciation module and then tell it what method or life you want for that particular class of assets. As far as the journal entry goes, as soon as you run depreciation in the depreciation module, that information is made available to Sage 100. So you do not have to do an export of the general ledger posting report out to Excel and import it into Sage 100. Sage 100 will actually pull that information directly from the fixed asset depreciation module. A couple of examples of what that looks like. Going through that process in Sage 100, it does generate these reports showing you what information was pulled over. Now let's talk about some of the resources available while doing your year-end using Sage Fixed Asset. So those of you using Sage 100 right now, for example, you may be using Sage City, which, as you know, is a pretty collaborative environment. It's used by the Sage development staff, support staff, as well as you, the customers, where information can be shared both ways. This is also where you can vote on future feature changes you'd like to see in the solution, which we do take seriously. Many of our feature updates do come from customer requests that are posted out in Sage City. But this is also where you can find knowledge-based articles and lots of useful information with what's going on with your product. Now, there's also a year-end resource center. At the year-end center, you can actually use either online on the site a year-end checklist. You can find knowledge-based articles and share information that you may have come across that you think would be helpful to your peers. That year-end checklist can be downloaded. modified, or you can simply use it there. So it gives you a nice way of having a consistent year-end processes that you can certainly share with the rest of your team. There's links to knowledge base articles as well if you are researching some information of how to do something. And of course, you can always reach out to support. But there's really great knowledge base articles out there, especially surrounding our releases. Links to Say University as well, where if you've added staff throughout the year, you need to get some training for some additional staff, you can certainly do that. So those are great resources. Now let's take a closer look at these year-end activities. So here's a screenshot of the actual year-end checklist that I actually downloaded. You can actually put it locally on your computer, modify it to your particular needs, and use that as your process for going through your year-end. So certainly one of the things you'll want to do on your year-end is make sure you do a full physical inventory. Then you can actually identify assets that are missing, for example, so that when you're doing your year-end processing and depreciation, you've already accounted for that. And of course, one of the things you'll first want to ensure that you do is get the latest tax update to ensure you've had, you can take advantage of any tax rule changes. Then you'll of course want to run depreciation and then get into some of your reports you would need for year-end. As I mentioned earlier, the audit advisor is certainly one of the things you'll probably want to be able to run. So especially if, for example, you're doing maker's depreciation for tax, or you're doing bonus depreciation, or you're doing Section 179. In this example here, you can see I do have an exception generated for exceeding the Section 179 limit. And I'll actually show you how this works in the solution in a few moments. But the audit advisor is really going to review everything you're doing in the company, identify anything that is a potential red flag for you to get audited. So think of it as a second set of eyes, so that by the time you do go to an external auditor, you're closing out your year end, you've got a second set of eyes that look things over for you. If you are doing the 168 allowance, or if you're doing maker's depreciation for tax, there's a mid-quarter test you can run, which will identify if you're exceeding 40% of the assets placed in service in Q4. And the solution has the ability to do a global change of changing from half-year convention to a mid-quarter convention. You can generate an actual fileable 4562. Of course, you can export that to a PDF file or as needed, but it is an actual 4562, which will capture all of the information needed by the IRS regarding that form. It will also generate the detail attachment with all of the details that you may also need. Also included is a tax expense report. This is the report that you would use to reconcile that 4562, and the numbers should match up if you have everything correctly. This will capture your Section 179 expense, your 168 expense, and some other details as well. This can be run in summary only, or you can run it in full details as I've done here, and it will have your totals on the last page. For sale of property, you can generate a 4797 worksheet, which will actually break everything down into your correct section property, so your 1245, 1250 property and so on. And on the second page, it will have all of the details for your ordinary gain losses, which you'll certainly need for your federal for year end. There's also a great property tax report included, which you can have it broken down by property tax category and acquisition year end, and you can sort and subtotal it in any way you choose. There's also a fixed asset summary or a roll forward report, which you can certainly use for year-end reconciliation. It's going to capture all of your beginning costs, ending costs, total accumulated depreciation info. It also is going to capture any transfers in or transfers out, as well as disposals on this report, and give you a total at the end. And it can be sorted in any way you choose. So let's take a moment now and go into the solution so that we can see how all of this actually works. Now I'm in the fixed asset depreciation module. So first, let's take a look at an asset detail so you can get a better understanding of what gets captured here. For those of you who have been using it for a while, you'll see the user interface has been updated. We do continually update the solution. Now, if you take a look at my asset details in this particular asset, I'm actually doing makers plus bonus. So I'm doing a 1/60th allowance, doing bonus at 100%. So if year-end rolls around, for example, and you want to look at what your numbers may look like with or without bonus, or if you have some assets that you're only doing 50% bonus, but you want to be able to change them en masse to 100% bonus, there's actually a 1/60th allowance switch. So I can change my bonus percentage for any subset of assets or across all the assets for any fiscal. So I can take a look at what it looks like in either scenario as well. Now, one of the features you can do is you actually can copy the tax book to one of the other books. So currently in the solution, there are 7 books. So if you're not using one of those custom books and you want to see what things would look like with or without bonus, you can certainly use one of those custom books. You can simply rename it as needed. You can turn off any of the books you're not using. And by the way, in the release that will be coming out in October, we will be increasing the total number of books from 7 to 20 books. So I went ahead and renamed this no bonus. So what I could do, if I don't want to make changes to my tax book, I can actually copy the tax book to that book, having it mirror the information, and I can then en masse make changes to the depreciation method or turn bonus offer on in that book and run reports where I can compare with or without bonus if I want to see it that way. But I certainly could simply just turn bonus offer on and run my report under the different conditions there. Now, for those of you that may have some qualified improvement property that are impacted by the CARES Act changes, this may be important to you. You can use the bulk edit tool. You can isolate that subset of assets by creating a group, for example. And as you know, under that IRS rule change included in the CARES Act, you can change all of your 39-year assets to 15 years, and you're now bonus eligible. So I can simply go in here, and if you're going to be taking these 39-year qualified improvement property assets, I can change them from whatever their current depreciation method is. If I'm going to do this no bonus, then you're required to use a straight line half-year convention. I can change my depreciation method from whatever they currently are to straight line half-year. I can also change at the same time my estimated life, so all of those 39-year assets, and change them in bulk to 15 years. And I can choose if I want to make that effective as of my current depreciation through date, or I can even go back to the placed in service date. Now, if any of these assets include a situation where I made some type of adjustment and I have a beginning date, beginning accumulated depreciation, beginning year to date information populated here because of some previous adjustment I've done, I can even tell it by selecting this box that I want to retain that beginning info, even though I'm going back to the place in service date. Now, certainly, if you don't want to change the past, because this would recalculate all depreciation back to the place in service date, that's why many users would choose to opt to use my current depreciation through date. That way, you're not changing anything you've already posted. And on the next screen, you would be able to validate those changes, and it's going to identify if there's any issue it sees that is against the IRS rules, because it does include all of the IRS rules. If you do want to see what changes are included in the current release, you can go to Help, What's New. It's going to give you a brief summary of both feature and tax rule changes. You can click on Learn More and see what the actual tax rule changes included in this current release. So in this release I'm using includes all of the tax rule changes added this past January, all of the changes to the Further Consolidated Appropriations Act, all of the tax extenders tied to that. But if I have vehicles, for example, I can look at what are the limits for light trucks or luxury automobile type limits. The tables are all built in. or I can look at what's changed for Section 179, for example, where they've now increased the limit by $20,000 for fiscal 2020 over 2019. So the new limit for 2020 will be $1,040,000. I can also look further back if I want to see all of the changes 2 years ago from the TCJA and all of the changes surrounding bonus depreciation. But think of this as really just a quick reference for you. Saves you having to go out to the IRS website and actually look and have this information up. Now, I did mention that you can also do a mid-quarter switch pretty easily. So I can simply go up here to depreciation, select Makers Convention switch, and I can do a global change, half year to mid-quarter convention for whichever tax year. Okay. Now, let's take a look at how that audit advisor works that I mentioned earlier, so you can see it actually in action. I'm going to actually isolate a couple of assets just to make sure I do have some that will show up. Yes. And then we'll go ahead and actually do that. So let's go to the audit advisor, and I'm going to run this for a prior year where I know I have some issues that will actually get picked up here. So let's take a look at my 2018 fiscal, running this for the tax book. And now you'll see it's generated a couple of exceptions. So I have a makers related issue here, but let's take a look at the Section 179 issue. You can see here it's generating an exception in red. It's going to tell you what the issue is. And it's telling me that the limit for that fiscal was $1 million. In the resolution, it's going to tell me what action I need to take to correct that issue. And it's telling me here that I need to reduce my 179 expense by more than $5 million. So certainly being that far out is going to create an issue for me. I would certainly get audited for that. Now it's going to create a group by this group name where any asset that's triggering that exception will actually show up in that group. So everything else looks fine. So let's go ahead and get out of that. So now if you take a look here, you'll see I have two auto-created groups. So let's take a look at the one labeled AA179 for tax for that fiscal year. And these are all of the assets that are triggering that exception. So if you take a look at this one, you can see here that I'm taking $675,000 for my 179 expense, which certainly is below that $1 million limit. If you look at the remaining items identified, I'm taking $700,000 on each of those. So combined, I'm well over the limit. So now I can simply reduce my 179 expense to ensure I'm in compliance with the limit for that year. Once I've concluded that, I can then go into my group setting, delete those auto-created groups, and now I can rerun the audit advisor to make sure everything is clean. So it does work quite well. Now, let's talk about how you're going to identify those assets, for example, after you've done an inventory that may need to be removed or disposed of. So let's do this. Let's take a quick look at the tracking module. I've completed an inventory prior, so I'm simply going to go into the tracking module where I'm going to actually generate the reconciliation report identifying what was missing. I created a group, and this is a subset of assets that I did an inventory on. And if you take a look at the details here, by the way, you'll notice that in the tracking module, there's no access to book fields. So the users that are using this module during your physical inventories cannot do anything to impact depreciation. You can attach images, invoices, and so on. And it does share the same database as the depreciation module. And it actually takes a nice variety of file types, so you can attach PDFs, JPEGs, bitmaps, and so on. So essentially anything, if you can scan it, take a picture of it, you can attach it. You can also, by the way, link a single image or invoice to multiple assets. So if you ordered, 20 new computers, for example, as a single invoice, you can link that single invoice to all of those assets quite easily. Now, as I mentioned, I've completed that inventory previously, so I'm going to actually rerun my inventory report, my reconciliation report on that subset of assets, so you can see how it gets identified. I'm going to run it for the group that I ran it for earlier. And you'll see here in this reconciliation report, it's going to identify the asset ID number, what it is, and these have a status of not found, a status of N. So these would be the items that are ghost assets that are costing you money, of course, because they're not in service, you're paying taxes and insurance on them, and you need to do a proper disposal of them and get them off the books. So you can simply search based on that asset ID number and do a disposal in the depreciation module. But the users using the tracking module would be the ones doing that physical inventory and being able to identify this for you, which you can then dispose. It will also identify anything found with no changes and any assets you made changes to. So let's go back into the depreciation module and talk about how you would handle actually doing these disposals. So I can search for, an asset ID number. The asset ID numbers, by the way, are going to be what you have generated on a barcode. So you would attach barcode labels. That barcode number is what actually translates to that asset ID number. So when you're doing that inventory, scan that barcode. That's how it knows you're looking at this particular item. So if I go to an asset here, you'll see that I have an asset ID number. That is the field that will actually be used for that. All of these general information fields can be customized, by the way, and that field in particular will take up to 50 characters, anything alphanumeric. So if I were to do a disposal of this asset, let's say it came up on my list of assets that were not found, I can simply choose that asset, choose my disposal date. I can do sale, abandonment, like-kind exchange, whatever type of disposal it is. So certainly if it's missing, you're going to be doing an abandonment or casualty. If it's simply an asset that you have in service, you're going to sell it off. It has some remaining net book value. You can do it by sale. And the system does support full or partial disposals. Let's actually do this disposal by sale just so we can generate some more numbers. So let's go ahead and put in cash proceeds. I'll go ahead and put in some expense of sale and hit calculate. And it's going to calculate my gain loss across all the books. Now, if you notice with this particular asset, I'm doing 100% bonus depreciation, first year placed in service, so my net book value is actually 0. But for GAAP, where I'm doing straight line for 5 years, you'll see I still have $24.50 in current net book value. That's why the corresponding differences in gain loss across my books. You can have a different cost basis between the books, by the way, as well, which would impact your gain loss calculation. If you took an investment tax credit and you needed to do some recapture, that information would be here. Let's take a look at the disposal worksheet before committing to this. If you're doing bonus depreciation or Section 179, this is going to be important to you. You can see everything that's going on in the background because your math won't be quite as simple now. Not just your cash, non-cash, or expense of sale calculating the gain loss versus the net book value. It's going to take a look at bonus depreciation. If any 179 recapture was required, you would see that calculated here as well. Let's go ahead and say OK with this disposal. And you'll see now that's where the transactions tab comes in. It's showing me I've done a full disposal by sale. My cash, non-cash, or expense of sale info. I can pull up the actual transaction or a worksheet, export it or print it as needed. Now, since I've done a full disposal here, you'll see that everything is going to be grayed out because this asset is now changed to a status of disposed. The history tab is going to capture everything from asset creation through disposal, and you'll see for today's date, it will show that the asset was disposed. It will show the date done in the system separate from the actual disposal date, because I could have future dated this to next week or next month if I chose to, and those dates would be different. It is going to capture your cash, non-cash, or expense of sale info. All of the data is going to remain here in your history tab unless you purge it. So if, for example, someone gave you the wrong asset ID tag, you made a mistake, you can simply go to the Transactions tab, delete last transaction, and it's like it never happened. Everything goes back to the way it was. Now, as I mentioned, you can do full or partial disposals in the solution, and you would do a partial disposal by disposing of some value, some portion of value of the asset. So if I go into an asset here where I've done a previous partial disposal, let's go into this one. You can see in the Transactions tab, I've got two previous partial disposal where I dispose of 15,000 here, 10,000 here, but I still have 80,000 in value that's continuing to depreciate. So if I wanted to come in and do another partial disposal, the difference here is I'm going to say yes here that this is a partial disposal, and I'm going to input the value of that portion that I'm going to dispose. So let's say I'm going to dispose of $5,000 portion of this value. I can put in a description because if I have multiple transactions, I may want to identify when I dispose what. It's going to reduce the cost basis by the disposal amount, and I can go ahead and put in my cash, non-cash, or expense of sale as before and say OK. And you'll see it's now created a third transaction here, which is a third partial disposal. My cost bases have all been reduced by that 5,000 disposal amount. And the History tab, of course, captures all of that, but it will show a bit different here. It's going to show that I've done a partial disposal. It's also going to capture what my book values changed from and to. So my cost bases were all reduced by $5,000. In this case, they were all the same. If I had a different cost basis between tax and books, it would actually list them out separately, okay? And just as before, I can reverse the transaction. The two previous transactions are still there. All of my values went back to where they are. Now let's take a look at the disposal report, because certainly that's one of the things you're going to need. Once you've done your physical inventory, dispose of those things that are missing, now you can certainly run your disposal report, which you can run for any date range you want. You can run this for a month, a quarter, a year, and you can sort and subtotal it in any way you choose, such as location, asset class, GL account, and so on. This is going to capture both full and partial disposal information. So let's take a look at what gets captured. The system number, which is automatically generated by the software, so each asset I add gets a unique system number. Asset ID would be coming from that asset tag, so this is user defined. Description of what it is, your in-service date, your disposal date, and under acquired value is going to be your disposal amount. So if it's a full disposal, it's going to be the full acquisition value. If you take a look at this line item 381, you can see I've got two entries in the same line item. That's because I've done two separate partial disposals on different dates. I did a $9,000 partial disposal on one occasion, a $4,500 partial disposal on another occasion. We'll give you totals for each column. It's going to capture your current accumulated depreciation, your net proceeds, your realized gain loss, and all of the reports in the solution are exportable to multiple formats. You can push this out to a PDF, Crystal Reports, CSV file, Excel, Excel data only, and so on. So many export options. Let's take a deeper look at some of the other reports that I mentioned that are going to be important to you. So let's go ahead and run that 4562 so you can see what that looks like. I'm going to run this for my 2019 fiscal. And we do update the 4562 to the correct tax year each year. That's part of the tax update that we do in January. So you can see my 2019 4562. My multi-year property, all your amortized property. You'll have both pages of the 4562, which you can certainly export, and you'll have the attachment details as well. And as I mentioned, there's a tax expense report, which you can certainly run that, which will identify that your 168 expense or your 179 expense matches up with what you have on that 4562. Now, there's also a really great sale of property report. So for your 4797, you can certainly run that. And as you'll see here, it's going to break everything down in your 1245, 1250 property. All of your ordinary gain losses will actually be on the second page. And you'll see all of the details there. And for the property tax report, you'll probably want to create groups so that you can isolate assets, say, if you're operating in multiple tax jurisdictions, for example. So I can easily create groups based on any criteria I choose, and I can run a report on just that subset of assets if I choose. I certainly could run this for all of the assets. So let's go ahead and run the property tax report. I can choose any subset, or I can run it for all my active assets. If you're using a field for identifying a property tax category, you can certainly do that. And you can even summarize assets older than 3 years or 5 years, whatever the case may be, based on what that particular tax jurisdiction requires you to do. So let's take a look at this. Let's make this bigger. And you'll see here, I have mine broken down by property tax category and acquisition year end. And again, this report is exportable. There's, of course, the mid-quarter report that I mentioned, things like your net book value report, and certainly you're going to need to run something like a depreciation expense report. Now, I did mention that you can actually modify the reports here. So if I wanted to run this report and change the sort order, I can select Format Report, Sort, and Subtotal in any way I choose, such as asset class, location, GL account, and so on. And I can, of course, save that as a custom version of that report. All of the standard reports you'll see has a white notebook symbol next to it. Everything with a yellow notebook symbol has something that I've changed, and I've saved it as a custom version. And this one, for example, I went in and modified the columns of data. I added current net book value, told it to give me a summation at the end, and even changed the orientation. I can also modify header and footer information. But let's go ahead and run the standard version of the depreciation expense report so you can see what that actually looks like. You can choose which book you want to run for. This will show your prior depreciation through date, current through date, and depreciation this run information. If you take a look at this, your in-service date, your acquisition value, your method, 168 if you're taking that, prior depreciation through date, of my case, of July 31st, current depreciation through date, August 31st. So my depreciation, this run column, is looking at 1 month's depreciation. It will have your totals less any disposals or transfers during that period. And again, this is exportable. If you need to look at projections looking at future year depreciation, there are projection reports included. I can look at a multi-year format where I can look at multiple books. I can look up to 99 years out in the future, and I can start from current fiscal, past, or present, or future fiscal. This one will simply give you full year depreciation for multiple years that you chose from the starting point you chose. And there's also another one that will actually show the information broken down by monthly period expense and year to date. So if you take a look at this one first, you'll see it's showing for my tax book, my internal, and my state book for the 5 years that I selected, and my total. If I need to see this broken down in a more granular fashion, I can take a look at the monthly projection, which will give me this information broken down by monthly period expense or year to date for a single fiscal. So let's go out to my 2021 fiscal. Now, you can future date assets here. These projection reports will calculate based on the existing assets as they depreciate down out to those future dates. But let's say you know that you're going to be expanding in 2021, adding $500,000 worth of assets out in the future. You can actually create assets just to use for projection purposes, future date them. This will actually pick it up. If you take a look at September here of 2021, you'll see I have a $400,000 increase. I can drill down in this one, look at the individual asset detail, and you'll see it is picking up something that I future dated here of $400,000. Same is true for looking at this from GAAP. It'll calculate based on the current assets as they're depreciating down, but I can certainly go out into any of those periods and drill down, look at the individual asset. Again, here's that projection asset that I'm using. But it gives you a great look at what's coming down the pipes as far as depreciation if you're involved in the budget and planning portion of the business and need that type of information. If you have scenarios where you have temporary differences between tax and book, there's actually a report that you can use to take a look at that as well. Let's go ahead and run that one. So a lot of people do need this for year end. And this will identify any temporary differences. Let me go to my last page here and reversal of those temporary differences. So here I do have a small difference between tax and book, and you'll see it's capturing that as well as that reversal. If you do need to run batches of reports, for month end, year end, and so on, you can go into the batch section, create a batch of which reports you want run, including custom reports, tell it to go ahead and run that batch. You can either send it to a printer or you can send this out in PDF, Crystal Reports, Excel, or Excel data only formats out to a folder. So if you do have repetitive reports to run, you can define a batch and actually take advantage of doing that. So there are many standard reports included as I mentioned, and you can modify those reports, or if you do need to create something custom in Crystal Reports, you can certainly go out to full-blown Crystal and create any type of ad hoc report looking at any information that you choose. Here's an example of a report, including graphs. You can add SQL expressions, formulas, but you can access any field in the database for any company in the database. So if you do have multiple companies. Now, for those of you that may have multiple users and you may have multiple companies and need to be able to separate who can actually go into what companies, you can actually create multiple profiles and identify users that you want to assign to that profile, and you can then limit who can do disposals, transfers, and so on. So it does give you a lot of great ability to actually handle that. So it's a pretty flexible and robust solution. There are, like I said, the depreciation module, the heart of the solution, the tracking module for doing physical inventory, and the planning module for actually handling CIP and then being able to place those items in service. And of course, the integration between the depreciation module and Sage 100 is great for those of you that are currently on that. And just so you can take a look at what that report looks like, if you want to run the general ledger posting report manually, you can absolutely do that. But as soon as you've run depreciation, this is the information that is made available directly to Sage 100. So you don't have to run this and export it. Sage 100 will actually pull this information capturing your depreciation expense, accumulated depreciation, debits, and credits info. So if I actually try to run it from the link here for Sage 100, it is going to tell me that, no, this won't post to it. Sage 100 will actually pull the data. So literally all I need to do at the end of the month or end of the year, whatever the case may be, I can run depreciation for all of my books or whichever books I want to run this for. Let's say I'm going to rerun this for my August period. I can have it run the depreciation expense report if I choose to, but I'll go ahead and say, okay, I've now run depreciation. If I go into any of my asset details, it's going to actually show you my current depreciation through date is 8 of 2020. My prior depreciation through date is 7 of 2020. I would, from inside of Sage 100, go through that month-end process and be able to pull that data directly from the fixed asset module so that you don't have to run that report, do an export, and import it. So let me pause here at the rest of the time remaining and see if there's any questions that came up in the chat. So let's take a look at that. And for those of you that need some more information, I'm going to hand you back over to Rick for a second here so you can talk about how you can get in touch with them and if we have any questions that are in the chat so that I can answer those for you. All right, looks like there is currently no questions in the chat. Rick, are you seeing any questions for me?
I'm here. I was having mute confusion. Looked like I saw one in there. There was a question about how many companies and assets that you can have in a database. Is there a limit?
No, there's no limit actually. So it's really based on capacity. So there's two different versions. There's a standard version, which will typically handle up to about 30,000 or so assets. It's not a hard stop. It's really more performance-based. And then there's a premier version, which runs on a SQL Server platform that can handle over 1 million assets, no problem. So the only limitation would be in a standard version. Let's say if you have, more than 30, 40,000 assets, it still will work. It's not going to stop you from creating new companies, but it certainly is going to be slower than if you're on a SQL Server version. But there is no limit to the number of companies. The licenses are not based on how many assets you have or how many companies you have. You can create as many companies as you want to.
Okay. And then there was one other one here about how does the integration, configure with Sage 100. So I think I know the answer to that one. Usually it would be, us here at Martin Associates that would help you, with the setup options to make the two systems talk to each other, and then set up some templates, and then just show you when you're processing purchase orders or AP invoices, how you would then use that integration to set that up. So that, I guess, comes right into this screen here. We don't have any more questions. Feel free to reach out to who you work with at Martin Associates. You could certainly contact me, or you could just contact Cincinnati at martinassociates.com, and your question will get routed to the right person. So hope everybody.
I do have one question, Rick, with what you just mentioned there with configuring the integration. I'm sure that, some customers that are currently using Excel, for example, may have a large number of assets. Do you also help with data migration as well?
Yep. So if you're switching from another system, or you're switching from the good old Excel, and that's what you've been using, there's a pretty slick import process where you can map all of the columns in your spreadsheet to the right fields in Sage Fixed Assets and import the assets right in.
Okay, great.
Yep. All right. Looks like that's it. How about on your side, Wayne?
Checking again here. All right, I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And Rick will make this recording available to any of you that may need to share this with your colleagues. And we can certainly also make the presentation available in PDF format if you would like that as well. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thanks a lot, Wayne. Good job. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.